One motivation for foreign policy is to maintain a balance of power internationally. The idea here is that if one nation becomes too powerful, it might end up sort of taking over smaller nations, right? And we can see this potentially with Russia's interference in Ukraine. And we've seen this over the years in the Cold War era when there was a balance of power between the US and the Soviet Union. And much of what motivated foreign policy from both nations was to stop either nation from increasing their sphere of influence too far. So for the most part, the US didn't actually stop the Soviet Union from doing what they wanted to do within their own nation. But when they started to try to expand, say by placing missiles in Cuba, which prompted the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we've talked about in terms of President Kennedy, or when perhaps they started interfering in Southeast Asia, which we've talked about in terms of Vietnam and Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. So when we saw those things happening, we intervened. So we wanted to maintain a balance of power. And to this day, there's still a sort of guiding principle of foreign policy that we want to maintain a balance of power. We don't want countries all of a sudden taking over other countries. We want things to remain relatively stable. And this doesn't just include militarily. We also want things to be relatively stable economically and politically. And for example, the national debt crisis in Greece and the more recent Brexit, which is really still ongoing, have been sort of uncertain in terms of stability. And how do we ensure the Eurozone stays economically stable when one nation, Greece, is having such a major debt crisis? And how do we ensure that the balance of power and trade does not get disrupted when Britain exits the EU? So we can see then that we want to ensure the stability economically, politically, and militarily in order to basically help complement these goals of access to markets and of security, and for us and our allies. So you can see how these different goals often are intertwined.